Ahoy! The devs have been chatting on the forums a little bit about upcoming content, and I wanted to update you on what's going on in multiple different niches at the moment. The first topic was about the supposed very near future balance changes that we were supposed to get on the PTR that were announced in the dev blog. D and Quixote asked what's up with that and if we could just get a straightforward answer about what's going on with this. I would not necessarily call the answer fully straightforward, but at least we got an answer. Edwin replied, "The honest answer here is that a lot is coming to Eternum, and in the cycle of development, it's just around the corner. In the cycle of the player, we've often shared when it's weeks or even days away. The expectations set did not quite match the language used, which we entirely understand. So for us it feels soon, but we understand that in this case, especially in relation to the past updates, that feels longer than normal. But I'm personally excited to share more, and I think it'll become clear when we do," which I know isn't the ideal response. Updates are incoming, and we hope that when we are ready to share more concrete timing and details, it will live up to the expectations. We look forward to your feedback when that time comes. But in the context of that statement, let's think about the actual timeline for a second here. We are getting leaderboards onto the live client soon. We'll talk about leaderboards more in just a second. And when that happens, shortly after that, we are supposed to get another update on PTR based on what the devs have said recently. So there should be another content patch that will then be released onto the live servers after it has been tested for a while. I wouldn't be surprised if we are not getting leaderboards on live client this week, but rather a little bit later. And knowing their typical spacing with PTR cycles, that'll probably take a little bit after that to release the next patch as well. We'd be very lucky to see it before that. If that is the case, the next update that would probably include the weapon changes as well as the armor changes that they talked about on the dev show would likely come around somewhere in mid-February-ish. At this point, we need to look at last year's content roadmap. In spring, what they scheduled was Tempest Heart Expedition, Blunderbuss, 3v3 PvP Arena, and the PvP reward track. The Heart of Madness update, which included both Tempest Heart as well as the Blunderbuss, came out on the 28th of March, and then in May we had arenas. However, they had already done larger content updates before that. In January they had introduced mutators, in December they introduced the full Winter Convergence Festival with, well, everything that came with it, whereas this year they only did a small addition to what already existed, and in November they had also done the Void Gauntlet release. In comparison, in the same cycle this year, we only got the small update to the Winter Convergence event, and we will be getting leaderboards, probably. In other words, there was definitely significantly less content, which means they are probably working on something. Now, looking at the content roadmap for this year, for spring we have Empyrean Forge Expedition, Gear Set Storage System, Springtide Bloom event, main story quest improvements. We also know that they are, to some degree at least, working on some changes to the PvP system, to the territory control thing. I don't know if that's gonna be something that will finish in spring, but we know that's something that they didn't want to put on the timeline because they don't know when it finishes. And on the show, the devs have also teased a mutator overhaul coming. And that's along with the weapon and armor balance changes that they're also working on. So what this makes me think is that the patch will likely be very big, because it's gonna be around the middle of February that we get to see it first, which would mean it would be a release in March very likely, which would put it in line with the content roadmap for spring, and that would mean that it is probably a ton of content, as Anwin says. If the next patch was just weapon and armor changes and that was it, then there would definitely be a communication issue once again, because that's not at all what Anwin's post here sounds like. It would also mean that the first spring update would come out really late, because the PTR cycle would be so much later based on having to test everything first and release it and so on, that we'd likely not see any of the spring content until mid-late April or so, and I don't really see why they would do that. That would not be a smart plan to do, so I would imagine that the next patch actually comes with parts of the spring content at least. This is especially true for the Springtide Bloom event, because why would they put a spring event towards the end of spring and close to summer? If that theory holds up, it would mean that they've basically put a bunch of content together that they've been working on for a while and try to release it all at once. I personally am not the biggest fan of that. I like spaced out content that just gives us a little bit to do all the time, just something new every month, but I guess that is also an angle that is very easy to take as a content creator, where it's much easier to make content when there is a consistent flow of significant updates. But I would assume that the sentiment is generally similar for most of the player base, just having something consistently new that gives you something to do in the meantime until some bigger patch drops, I think is nice for most. But that is not the only update we got. There was also a post about leaderboards on the PTR. Hi adventurers, we are temporarily disabling leaderboards for the next few hours for backend AWS changes. We will follow up when leaderboards have been re-enabled. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Couple hours later, leaderboards have been re-enabled in PTR. No significant changes were made to the player-facing side at this time. Thank you for your patience. I had a look back on PTR after only the first change was out, and there's definitely no change to what's counted for rewards in terms of score or 3v3 arenas, so same disappointment as before. I was kind of looking forward to seeing something change there, but I did look at the mutators, and what I noticed, and I'm not sure if this was the case before, but if you go to a mutation level below mutation 10, there are no rewards on the side. I didn't verify if this was the case beforehand or if this is a new change that was introduced, but either way, it's good to know that you have to do a mutation level 10 in order to actually get any of the leaderboard rewards. What is interesting to me is that they're still doing backend changes to leaderboards and they're changing something on the PTR, which gives me hope that maybe they aren't done with leaderboards just yet. I'm inclined to believe that we will not see leaderboards released this week, maybe next week, and maybe by then they have changed more things and maybe they have listened to the feedback and there will be different qualifiers for what actually gets rewarded. Again, if you haven't yet, definitely tell them in the PTR forums how you feel about score being used on the leaderboards. Jiggy Spice posted an interesting thread about a different topic. After 300 hours, I still don't have BiS gear. I'm actually going to read this one out because I think this person makes some very good points. The RNG progression is really bad. I wish we had a vendor or some kind of definite road towards progression. The only real way to get BiS gear is to buy it from the marketplace, but that requires millions of gold just for one build. And you need to keep checking trade post and trade chat until the gear you want is available. The way of progression also heavily incentivizes RMT, because grinding up several million gold takes too much time and luck. I've opened thousands of OPR boxes and I'm well beyond PvP track 200. I've gotten maybe 2 best in slot items but not the armor class or attributes for my build. It would be great if the faction vendor would sell 600 gear score gear and weapons with Shirking Fort, Freedom and Resilient. They can cost Azor Salt and they can be expensive, but please let us get a better path of progression than 100% RNG. Now, I don't necessarily think that the only option here is the faction vendor. There are many ways in which gear could become more accessible, but I am strongly of the opinion that the current progression isn't good, and one thing that Jiggy points out later multiple times is that there's just no clear progression because it's all RNG, and I think that is a very big problem with the gear in New World. I also very much agree with the RMT/buying gold problem, and that is something that I want to address here a little bit. I spent many of my days in New World with very competitive players that are focused on PvP, and they were obviously aiming to get best in slot gear. I personally will never buy gold in New World. The reason is very simple. I'm a content creator for the game, and if I get my account banned for buying gold, then that would be a massive downside for me because it would make my job significantly harder, which is not the case for most other people. I am generally also very against buying gold in online games, but realistically, in New World specifically, I would feel very, very inclined to buy gold if I wasn't a content creator. The choice is very, very easy when you consider how many hours of grinding gold in relatively tedious ways you would have to do in New World to get anywhere near buying one piece of best in slot, compared to how many hours you would have to work in most jobs to get gold cap. The number of people who can't afford to buy gold because all of their money goes directly into their living expenses, but at the same time can afford to spend hours and hours and hours grinding gold in New World is probably very limited. I'm not saying they don't exist, but I'm saying the incentive for players to buy gold is very, very high, and I know of many competitive players that have done it, and I can understand why they do it if you just factor in your time investment versus reward. And I simply think that is bad from a game design standpoint. I can see where this person is coming from. The progression could be very simple and very clear. Activities that are related to the rewards you want should give you similar rewards. So a PvP related activity should probably give you gear with Resilient, whereas a dungeon should probably give you Ward gear. This is true to some degree, but there are thresholds. I think a very good example of where this is executed well is with the heavy set from the PvP track. This comes with locked perks completely. If you get one of the pieces, then it'll have Resilient, Refreshing Ward, and Shirking Heals. This is not a best in slot because it's Shirking Heals instead of Shirking Fortification, but you get the idea here. This is basically like a 2.5 perker. Making balanced sets like that available from the PvP track for all weights, and then maybe also with the option to choose your attribute somehow, would give them much more usability. And then maybe you could say every 50 PvP tracks, you can choose a piece that is actually a best in slot piece. So by the time you get to 200 track, you would have a 4 out of 5 set. And realistically, if you didn't use any of the early, well, not exploits, but tricks to get a faster PvP track, it takes very, very long to actually get to 200 track. There also wouldn't be an issue with people getting best in slot, because once somebody has some best in slot, they will probably want to try out other loadouts anyways and need other gear for that, so it's not like they would all suddenly quit the game once they reach best in slot. Those are my thoughts. Returning to the thread, Aimon said, "We are constantly looking at and evaluating the current state of progression. I don't have an exact answer to your question at the very moment, but we are aware of what's being discussed here." I think this is a hopeful sign. A gear overhaul won't be easy, but them acknowledging it is a very important first step. An important second step is for you to click subscribe and the bell if you want to see my video in the near future about freedom and how that interacts with certain mechanics when it comes to capping out freedom, which I think is a very interesting topic. I'll also link another video here where I rate the current attribute perks that we have in the game. And at this point I'd like to thank my patrons for supporting this video and you for watching. Also, if you want to ask any questions for the Q&A, then feel free to drop them in the comments. I will be going through that soon, so last chance to get your questions in. Thanks for watching, SLOTH out.